past 150 years have seen many different types of foreign intervention. Some of them have been, in fact, benign, although usually the conquests that preceded them were not. Occupation by Austria-Hungary for that 40 years from 1878 to 1918 involved probably the most brutal and costly conquest of Bosnia until the Second World War, but was followed by a period of gradually developing considerable prosperity and building, development of the country. So it's difficult to say that occupation and then annexation was all destructive. It was not. And in general, it seems that Bosnia has done the best when it has been part of a broader entity for, first of all, the Ottoman Empire from around 1460 to maybe 1650, part of the Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg Empire in those 40 years from 1878 on, and then as part of socialist Yugoslavia from roughly 1945 to say 1975. And in those situations, Bosnia has benefited from free markets across various borders and an opportunity to develop a certain selfhood as a political entity, as a republic in the socialist period, as a corpus separatum under Austria-Hungary, and really as in the earlier period, as a distinct set of initially several administrative units, and by the end of the Ottoman period, the entity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was itself recognized as a part of the Ottoman Empire. So I don't think that you can say that it's always bad that Bosnia is indeed administratively part of some larger entity. And in fact, I think today the hope of many Bosnians, certainly my hope, is that Bosnia will again be part of a larger entity, namely the European Union, and that it will benefit greatly from that association and from being a part of that emerging, although slowly emerging, unified political structure. It was really, I would characterize it as an effort by the great powers to impose order on an area that had become quite chaotic with contending emerging states. I think that they actually succeeded in establishing some order, but it didn't last very long. It lasted certainly no longer than the Balkan Wars. It recognized those states that had already essentially become autonomous as independent and denied that recognition to other states. Didn't, for example, recognize Albania, didn't recognize Bosnia, and instead treated Bosnia as a sort of a trading chip to be given to Austria-Hungary in exchange for the losses that the Ottoman Empire experienced and were also denied to Austria-Hungary. The Congress of Berlin was very much a landmark, a very important point in time. But at the same time, it was important in terms of recognizing these new states and their statehood. But at the same time, it did so at a time when there were still yet other states emerging and aspiring to recognition as autonomous or independent. And it was the emergence of those states and then the additional ambitions of other states that caused the instability that ended in World War I and ultimately the great conflagration that took down all the empires in the region, the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian. There probably is no such thing as closing a circle in historical processes. They continue, and we've certainly seen the continuation of the earlier trends amongst competition of these newly emerging states for additional territory. I mean, I think you look at nationalism, which is really the defining phenomenon of the 19th century, particularly the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, and see that it was first used by small peoples to rebel against imperial structures. And those nationalisms were in fact quite positive, ideologically speaking. They looked forward to a better future and glorified democratic principles. But it was when the nationalisms began to clash with one another that the greatest violence broke out. And that violence has intermittently continued up to the present time. Certainly as regard to Bosnia, if you look at the way that, historically, at the way that empires and outside forces, if you consider, the Western Alliance an empire, which it is in part anyway, and look at the Austro-Hungarian contribution, these weren't really nearly as destructive as the efforts by Bosnia's immediate neighbors, specifically Serbian, Croatian, somewhat lesser Montenegro, to exert an influence or even to annex or divide the country. Those are the things that have been the most insidious and destructive forces that have operated on Bosnia, not the imperial structures themselves. I think it is always has been primarily, let's say in the first instance, a geostrategic question. Bosnia is essentially a landlocked country, which means it's surrounded on all sides, except for a narrow strip of territory at name by powers or by countries which essentially have been stronger over time than Bosnia itself has been. And that therein lies the first part of the equation. The second part of the equation is that Bosnia has always been coveted for its natural resources, for its people, and for the access that it can provide to communications and infrastructure amongst and between its neighbors. So the aspirations of its neighbors have periodically been whetted and led to attacks, occupation, and even division amongst the immediate neighboring states. And that's fundamentally a geostrategic issue. There is a moral issue, however, and I think it's the same moral issue that confronts those who would seek to destroy or annex any country, and that is that the Bosnia-Herzegovina has a right under international law and the United Nations Charter to self-determination and to freedom from outside interference. And those, of course, those principles actually are, in some sense, violated by certain provisions of the Dayton Agreement, but also been violated in practice by its neighbors really throughout the 20th century, but particularly intensively in the period after 1990. Well, I think it's a common assumption that the national question has an answer. It doesn't. There are always territories on the face of the earth that are the subject of contention between and among different peoples and different countries. And unless one wishes to go to the ultimate solution of completely separating peoples by force, or even eliminating entire peoples. The national question has no answer. The best that can happen is that peoples accommodate one another, which is a word that I've come to prefer over tolerance. It means recognizing differences, respecting differences, and not imposing by force one's own views or values or culture on another country or another people. So I don't think that there was any possibility ever that the national question could be resolved at any of the major conferences, peace conferences of the 19th century, nor for that matter in any of the wars. It simply goes on and calls out for a situation or a resolution which involves accommodation rather than hegemony. I think it's a part of a broader phenomenon, which is state fragmentation. The phenomenon of the nation state, which in a sense is not properly named. There is no nation state that is pure, although many nationalists in the Balkans assume or believe that the nation states of Western Europe are nationally pure. They are not. Nation state as a phenomenon really sort of peaked in power, in my view, in the Second World War, when you had two behemoths battling one another, the Soviet Union, which was very much a Russian nation state, and the Third Reich. And then, of course, there were other players from elsewhere on the globe that got involved. But when those two entities fought one another, it marked the beginning of a gradual decline of the nation state, which manifests itself in fragmentation. Not universally. Obviously, the European Union was just the opposite. It was a product of more of a coming together and moving toward integration. But what we've seen, particularly since the 1980s, has been progressive weakening of state structures, the emergence of non-state actors of various kinds, certainly fundamentalist forces of various religions are among them. And of course the national movements must be counted among them. I like to show to my classes a map of Southeast Europe in 1550, when there was essentially one state governing the entire territory, the Ottoman Empire. In that territory today, there are 13 states, one of which became independent as recently as 2008. And I think we can, with some confidence, say that the process of fragmentation and disintegration is likely to continue. We see evidence of it in certainly in the Central European region with Ukraine, and to some degree in Southeast Europe as well. In Western Europe, of course, we have at the moment anyway, a weakening of the integration impetus for the European Union and the emergence of rightist forces, which will, if they're allowed to run unchecked, or they do run unchecked, will probably destroy the very states in which they live and further the process of fragmentation. The recognition of Bosnia's independence, of course, took place at a time when the breakup of that state was already beginning. It wasn't very advanced yet, but it was certainly in the works. The international community felt obligated to come up with a solution that would be inclusive of all major groups in the country. And I think that was wrong. I didn't think they had to do that. But certainly they believed and concluded that they did. So the recognition, if you look at it in the long run, including the Dayton Peace Agreement, has itself entailed a recognizing a state that is divided between the Federation and the RS, and even further divided into the cantons in the Federation. And the obstruction to the functioning of a common state in the RS and to some degree in we'll call them the former territories of Herzegovina, have meant that the internal factors weakening Bosnia's independence and sovereignty have been equally as important as the external factors. It's very easy, I think, for those of us who value Bosnia, and that's most Bosnians and some of us who really love the place and love the Bosnian people. Very easy to say, well, it's all Dayton. The Dayton Agreement is written in such a way that it ensures indefinite separation and stagnation. Well, it is partly Dayton, but in fact there are provisions in Dayton that would allow for a much different outcome if the domestic factors were to consent to a more effective and centralized Bosnian state. Obviously, people like Richard Holbrooke and many others at the time hoped and expected that by introducing truly democratic elections, that the hard-headed nationalist opposition would be broken and replaced by a much more reasonable and pro-Bosnian forces. That really hasn't happened in any great quantity. Not that it couldn't happen fairly soon with the emergence of certain factors and certain changes, but I think when you look at the reasons that Bosnia is effectively not a functioning state today, you have to blame the domestic political formations as well as those who drafted and crafted the Dayton Agreement. The tradition of which we wrote, which goes back even before the arrival of the Ottomans to the time of the medieval Bosnian state and the Bosnian Church, it is indeed a tradition of tolerance, or as I said, I kind of now prefer the word accommodation. That is not the same as a fusion or erasure of the differences among peoples and religions. It means a recognition that that people are different customs, different cultures, different national identities, different religions, but that they all agree on the importance of being together and working together to build a domestic society and some form of state or autonomous entity that preserves all of their national identities as well as the identity of Bosnia. That's the tradition. And as we point out in the book, there have been major exceptions in which that tradition has been not respected and in fact is almost destroyed, most significantly the Second World War, but also the years of oppression of Serbs in particular during the First World War. And I would say the same for this period from 1875 to say, the fall of 1878, when rebellions took place in the area of Herzegovina and Herzegovina, and then culminated in this very bloody battle of conquest by the Austrians. So there have been exceptions to this great tradition of tolerance that prevailed through most of the centuries. Clearly, the most recent war resulted in, or was in essence, a betrayal of that tradition. And I think we have lost a great deal of the zajednički život, the common life that Bosnia enjoyed over the centuries. But not all of it. And I still have some hope that it will make a comeback, in a sense, that we'll get to the point where, again, as indeed has happened in many societies that have been at war. It's taken a while, but it does happen that the people again recognize their common interests are more important, and in some respects anyway, than their separate nationalist interests. One of the observers of Yugoslavia has noted that Yugoslavia was a bad idea, but a necessary one. And I think it's true that the Yugoslav impulse really arose out of necessity. All of the peoples that were a part of Yugoslavia from 1918 to 1992, essentially, had a recognition at some level that they couldn't make it in this world alone. The strongest of these peoples, of course, from the 19th century on, was in fact the Serbs. And many Serbs looked at Yugoslavia as a veiled form of the Serb people's nation. But many other peoples looked at it as a solution to protect their own weakness, or protect them from their weakness vis-a-vis their neighbors. That's the way that Yugoslavia was formed in 1918, is the recognition, particularly on the part of the Croats, that the Italians were taking advantage of the lack of any meaningful Croatian armed force to reconquer much of the Dalmatian coast. And so they quickly fell into the hands of those who wanted a greater, or wanted to form Yugoslavia, as well as there were many true believers in Yugoslavism among Croats, and for that matter, Bosniaks and other peoples, Slovenes as well at that time. I don't think it's a terribly simple matter to classify Yugoslavism as simply a vaguely cloaked form of Serb nationalism. It was that for many Serbs, but for many more, it was not. It was a legitimate dream and an answer to the problem of small nations in a world dominated by great powers. First of all, the assassination took place after the two Balkan Wars. The impact of Serbia's successes in the Balkan Wars was to whet the appetite of the expansionists in Belgrade for further conquests, particularly against the Habsburg Empire, which Serbs viewed as the archenemy of Serbia and the representation of an old order that had denied to Serbs for so long a time their own expansive great Serb state. So if you look at the assassination in that light, there was a conspiracy, and it was partially cloaked from the government of Serbia, but there were also high government officials involved in it to provide support for this ragtag bunch of amateur assassins and students, most of them no longer students, most of them unemployed, and some of them from peasant backgrounds, very unsophisticated. And those assassins more or less fell into their hands, more or less fell into their lair, into their circle, as they became known to the APIS group. In that light, it wasn't a very good conspiracy. If you really wanted to conquer Bosnia, you would have involved a much more detailed plan and recruited many more effective people to carry it out. And the assassins themselves proved to be inept but very lucky. So I view it as a, let's say, an ineffective conspiracy carried out by inept operatives who were only partially under the control of the people who were supporting them. The fact that Princip was able to shoot both the Archduke and his wife simply has to be as much luck, and in fact it was luck that the Archduke on that particular day, his driver, didn't get the memo about proceeding along the Obla and instead turned right, right by where the Hotel Europa was and is, and placing his targets right immediately in front of him. So the assassination was as much luck as anything. And it was then, of course, exploited ruthlessly by the war parties in the Habsburg Empire, which goaded the military and likewise the war circles in the military to prepare for and carry out an attack. So I think the assassination is in a sense overdone. It's far from the earth-shaking event that it has become in mythology, and was much less important than the machinations that followed upon it in actually causing the war. Well, I regard this argument about terrorists or liberation hero as a futile, pointless argument between among two false dichotomy. There is every terrorist, by the very definition of the word terrorism, is in fact doing so for a political cause. He or she always wants to liberate something. So there isn't really even a dichotomy between these two positions. And I would rather spend time and energy trying to assess the significance of this event. I'm actually giving a paper at this conference in which I trace over time the evolution of the deceased GAVRILO Princip. First as a terrorist who was vilified by the Austro-Hungarian government at the same time that Sophie and Ferdinand are glorified. And then in post-war Yugoslavia, that is interwar Yugoslavia, as a Yugoslav national hero. Then, of course, he again becomes a pariah during the Second World War to the ruling Ustasha regime. And then when he emerges under socialism again, he isn't so much a Yugoslav hero as he is a hero of revolutionary youth. That's what the plaque said that they put up right in May of 1945. And then his last evolution, which I believe will be permanent, is his evolution into a celebrity. A celebrity is someone that we don't morally judge as good or bad, evil or meritorious, but we're fascinated by a celebrity because of what he or she accomplishes or for the unique traits of that person. The nice thing about the evolution of Princip into a celebrity is that we don't have to agree at all on what he really was. We only have to agree that he was a significant historical figure and that he had qualities that make him of significance to a large number of people in retrospect. So we could, for example, have a monument in which there are 10 different viewpoints, interpretations of Princip's life, or we could have a museum like that, instead of one monolithic, linear interpretation of his life and deed. That's what I would like to see. I'd actually like to see the memorial to Princip and the conspirators be turned into a peace memorial in honor of the deceased of both civilian and military of the First World War. I think there's no one who knows better than the people of Sarajevo the devastation that war brings. And it's been a long time in Europe since any place has experienced that degree of death and destruction as Sarajevo and Bosnia experienced in the 1990s. I think it would be absolutely appropriate and, in fact, a very constructive thing to turn the monument and memory of Princip into a memorial for all of the dead of the First World War. Well, of course, we can never know. That's a counterfactual. But I think we certainly can say that there were other factors that were far more important than the assassination in leading up to the war. Had there been no assassination, it seems to me extremely likely that these other factors would have eventually pushed Europe into just the kind of confrontation that took place in essentially August of 1914. As I say, we'll never know for sure. But if you follow the trends that were in progress, the high degree of militarization of the key states, the growing ambitions of Austria-Hungary, which is one of the weaker of the major powers, the German tendency to support Austria-Hungary, and the British willingness to ally with France and conduct a war on the seas as well as on land. All these things would suggest that with time, even in the absence of an assassination, it's very likely we would have ended up in a war. I prefer to look at this process as the result of the development of historical narratives. Every movement has its own historical narrative. Sometimes they take a while to develop, but the function of an historical narrative is to explain and justify the acts of the movement that develops it. There are historical narratives that are based on empirical research alone, but even the principles of empirical research are themselves a sort of ideology. So all historical narratives are, in some sense, a product of a set of assumptions. And it isn't the fact that these narratives exist that select certain facts and ignore others, or even invent facts and discount more obvious, screamingly obvious facts. It is the way in which they are used by the people who believe in them. And they, in fact, can be very benign and even positive. If they're benign, typically the historical narrative will also be a more moderate one. It will include, for example, the notion that the group in question respects the rights of others. So, for example, the human rights movement, which definitely has its own narrative of world history, is a very, very positive narrative, and the people who are promoting it, in my view, are doing wonderful things to make the world a better place. Not so the narrative, say, of the historical narrative that was developed by the SDS or by the HDZ or by the Nazi Party in Germany, or for that matter, Al-Qaeda. These narratives are destructive, but they're not destructive because of the narratives, because of the accounts themselves. They're destructive because of the way in which their proponents instrumentalize them to create, justify opportunities to act against other people with force.